From the moment Lucas could walk, he had a ball at his feet. In the dusty streets of his small town, where the sun painted everything in shades of gold, he kicked anything that rolled, bottles, rocks, an old deflated ball he'd found behind the house. The neighbors watched, some smiling at his enthusiasm, others shaking their heads in disbelief. You see, Lucas wasn't like the other boys. While they grew taller, faster, and stronger, he stayed the same, short, slender, with arms and legs that seemed too small for the game he loved. But Lucas never saw it that way. To him, football was magic. The feeling of the ball under his feet, the way he could control its every move, was something no one could take from him. And if there was one thing Lucas wanted more than anything, it was to play football professionally. Not just any football. He wanted to represent his country, to wear that jersey with pride and show the world what he could do. At school, Lucas's dream was no secret. His classmates knew how much he loved the game. Yet, every time teams were picked for the schoolyard matches, he was left standing on the sidelines. The taller boys, the ones with bigger muscles and louder voices, got chosen first. Lucas is too small, they'd say. He'll get crushed out there. And just like that, the ball would roll without him. Lucas kept quiet, too shy to argue. He'd sit on the sidelines, knees pulled to his chest, and watch as the game unfolded. The sound of the ball hitting the ground, the laughter, the cheers. It all felt like a world he wasn't part of, but so desperately wanted to be. Still, even though they didn't let him play, Lucas would spend hours after school with the ball, perfecting his dribbles, practicing shots against the wall until the sun dipped below the horizon. His mother, Anna, was his biggest fan. She didn't know much about football, but she knew her son. She saw how he never gave up, even when the world seemed to be telling him to stop. "You have a gift, Lucas," she would say, her voice soft but firm. "It doesn't matter what anyone else thinks. If you love football, you keep playing. One day, they'll see what you're capable of." But it was hard for Lucas to believe that sometimes. The whispers followed him everywhere. In the neighborhood, at school, even during family gatherings. "He's a good boy, but let's be honest, he'll never make it. He's just too small for football." They all had good intentions, but their words stung like cuts. Lucas learned to smile and nod, but deep down, every comment was like a weight added to his chest. Still, there was something inside him that wouldn't let him quit. Every time the doubts crept in, Lucas would lace up his worn-out sneakers and head to the empty field by his house. There, in the solitude of the evening, he could pretend he was playing in the biggest stadiums in the world. He imagined himself wearing the national team jersey, scoring the winning goal in the final minutes of the game. The crowd would roar, and for a moment, Lucas would feel like he belonged. But dreams, no matter how vivid, couldn't erase the reality he faced every day. His size was a constant reminder of the obstacles ahead. He knew he wasn't growing like the other boys. His reflection in the mirror showed him that every morning. And as much as he tried to push it aside, there were nights when the doubts weighed too heavily. Lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, Lucas would wonder, what if they're right? What if I'm just too small? It wasn't just the physical challenges, though. Lucas was shy, always fading into the background, hoping people wouldn't notice him. In a world where confidence and bravado seemed to win you a place on the team, Lucas's quiet demeanor made him an easy target for dismissal. He wasn't the loudest, nor was he the most imposing. And in a game like football, sometimes those qualities mattered more than skill. But there was one thing Lucas had that no one could take away: his love for the game. No matter how many times they told him he was too small, too weak, too shy, Lucas couldn't stop thinking about football. It was in his bones. It was all he dreamed about. And somewhere, deep inside, even though the world seemed stacked against him, Lucas believed that if he kept pushing, kept playing, his time would come. The schoolyard had become Lucas's biggest test. Every day, he hoped someone might give him a chance to prove himself, but it never came. The teams were always picked. The games were always played, and Lucas remained on the sidelines, watching. The other boys didn't mean to hurt him. Not really. but their words carried a weight he couldn't shake. "You're too small to play with us," they'd say, sometimes with a grin, sometimes with a shrug. To them, it was just a fact. To Lucas, it felt like the door to his dreams was slowly closing, bit by bit. He started to withdraw even more. At school, he kept his head down, avoiding eye contact with the boys who once were his friends. It wasn't that they were unkind, they just didn't see him as a real part of their world. After all, football was everything to them, and in their eyes, Lucas didn't belong on the field. He wasn't tall enough, wasn't strong enough, and no matter how hard he practiced after school, it felt like no one noticed. But Lucas's mother did. She noticed the way he came home quieter than usual, how he spent more time staring at the floor or kicking his ball against the wall instead of asking to go play in the park. Anna knew her son better than anyone, and she could see the weight he was carrying on his young shoulders. One evening, as Lucas sat outside on the porch, tapping the ball softly against the ground, his mother came and sat beside him. The silence stretched between them until she finally spoke. "Lucas," she said gently, "I can see it's been tough for you. The boys at school, they don't always understand, do they?" Lucas shrugged, his eyes glued to the ball. "They just don't think I'm good enough." Anna placed a hand on his shoulder. "That's not true. They're just looking at the wrong things. They don't see what I see. You have something special, Lucas. But sometimes it takes people a little longer to recognize it. You have to keep believing in yourself. One day they'll see." Lucas wanted to believe her, but the doubt was starting to sink in deeper. Every day felt like a battle, one that he was losing. His size wasn't just a physical limitation anymore. It was like a label that he couldn't shake. No one expected anything from him, and that hurt more than the size of the players on the field. Even when he played with the younger kids, he couldn't help but feel out of place. Then there was the whispering. It started small, just a few kids here and there, questioning why Lucas kept showing up if no one picked him. But soon, it felt like everyone had something to say. Why does he even try? He's too short to be any good. He should just quit. Lucas heard them all, and as much as he tried to brush it off, their words stung. He found himself wondering, in those quiet moments before sleep, what if they're right? What if I'm just not meant for this? The thought scared him more than anything. Football was all he had ever wanted, and the idea of giving up on that dream left a hollow ache in his chest. At school, the days continued much the same. The boys would gather to play, the teams would be picked, and Lucas would sit on the sidelines, pretending it didn't bother him. But inside, the frustration was growing. He felt invisible, ignored, like no one even cared how hard he had been working. Then came the day when everything seemed to hit its breaking point. It was a Friday afternoon, and as usual, the boys were forming teams. Lucas didn't even bother standing with them anymore. He just headed to the side of the field, ball in hand, ready to practice alone. That's when he heard it. "Hey, Lucas!" One of the taller boys, Marcos, shouted from across the field. Lucas looked up, surprised. "Wanna play?" Lucas's heart leapt. Maybe today was the day. Maybe today they'd finally see what he could do. He jogged over to the group, his heart pounding in his chest, hope flickering in his eyes. But as soon as he reached them, Marco smirked. "Just kidding. You'd get squashed out there." The laughter that followed echoed in Lucas's ears. His stomach dropped, and without a word, he turned and walked away, fighting back the sting of tears. He wasn't going to cry, not in front of them. He wouldn't give them that satisfaction. Back at home, Lucas locked himself in his room, trying to make sense of the swirling emotions inside him. He was angry at the boys for treating him that way, angry at himself for caring so much. He kicked his ball against the wall, harder and harder, as if that would somehow make the frustration go away. But it didn't. Nothing did. That night, for the first time, Lucas thought about giving up. Maybe football wasn't for him. Maybe he wasn't strong enough, wasn't big enough to make it in a world that seemed to be built for taller, louder, stronger people. Why keep trying when no one believed in him? The thought was like a heavy stone in his chest. But then he remembered his mother's words. He could hear her voice in his head, soft but steady. "You have something special, Lucas. Don't give up." Maybe she was right. Maybe he couldn't quit. Not yet. Not when football was the only thing that made him feel alive. The weekend came, and Lucas couldn't stop thinking about what had happened on the field. The laughter, the look on Marcos' face, the way everyone just accepted that he didn't belong. It all replayed in his mind over and over. For the first time in a long while, Lucas considered not picking up the ball that day. Maybe it was time to let go of the dream. After all, what good was it chasing something that seemed impossible? But that voice, his mother's voice, echoed in his head. "Don't give up. You have something special." It was almost annoying how much those words stuck with him, how they refused to leave him alone, even when all he wanted to do was forget about football altogether. But deep down, Lucas knew he couldn't walk away. Football wasn't just a game for him. It was part of who he was. And no one, no matter how many times they laughed or doubted him, could take that away. So, Lucas made a decision. If they didn't want to let him play, fine. He'd train alone. He'd practice harder than anyone else, not to prove them wrong, but to prove to himself that he wasn't done yet. Maybe his body wouldn't grow, but his skill could. He could get faster, smarter, better with the ball. And one day, when the time was right, they wouldn't be able to ignore him anymore. Early Sunday morning, while the streets were still quiet and most people were asleep, Lucas grabbed his old, worn-out ball and headed to the dirt field near his house. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the ground. It was peaceful, and in that moment, Lucas felt free. No one was watching. No one was judging. It was just him and the ball. He started with the basics, dribbling between two rocks he had set up as makeshift cones. At first, his movements were stiff, uncertain. His mind was still heavy with the events of the week. But as the minutes passed and the rhythm of the ball against the ground became more familiar, Lucas started to find his flow. He lost himself in the movements, his feet tapping the ball from side to side, his body moving instinctively, as if the ball and his feet were connected by an invisible thread. He practiced dribbling, shooting, passing against the wall. Hour after hour, he stayed on that field, pushing himself harder and harder. He imagined himself in the biggest stadiums, playing alongside the world's greatest players. He envisioned wearing the jersey of his country, hearing the crowd chant his name. Every shot, every pass, every sprint was a step closer to that dream. By the time the sun was high in the sky, Lucas was drenched in sweat, his legs burning from the effort. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. There was something driving him now, something stronger than the doubts, stronger than the laughter. It was a fire inside him that refused to go out. From that day on, Lucas made it a habit. Every morning before school, he'd wake up early, grab his ball, and head to the field. While the other boys slept, he trained. While they laughed at him, he worked. And slowly but surely, he began to see the improvement. His dribbling became sharper, his shots more accurate, his endurance better. He didn't need anyone to tell him he was good. He could feel it. But as much as he loved those moments alone on the field, reality was never far behind. At school, nothing had changed. The boys still didn't pick him for games, still made jokes at his expense. And as much as Lucas wanted to believe that hard work alone would be enough, he couldn't help but wonder if it would ever matter. Would anyone ever give him a real chance? One day, after a particularly tough training session, Lucas sat down on the grass, catching his breath. His legs ached, his body was sore, but it was a good kind of pain, the kind that reminded him he was getting stronger bit by bit. As he looked out at the empty field, he thought about everything he had gone through, all the times he had been pushed aside, all the comments about his size, all the moments of doubt. It had been a long road, and Lucas knew it wasn't going to get any easier. But he also knew something else. He wasn't going to quit, no matter how many times they laughed, no matter how many times they told him he wasn't good enough. Lucas would keep showing up. He would keep working, keep pushing, keep believing. Because deep down, even on the hardest days, He knew this was what he was meant to do. Football was his dream, and as long as he had that dream, he wasn't about to let anyone take it from him. Lucas had been training alone for weeks, waking up before dawn to practice in the empty field. The progress was real. He could feel it in the way the ball responded to his feet and how his body moved more fluidly. But progress or not, nothing had changed at school. The other boys still looked past him, their eyes always scanning for the bigger, faster players. Then, one Friday afternoon, everything changed. Lucas had just finished another long day at school. He was tired, his muscles aching from the early morning training, but he headed to the field anyway, as he always did. The dirt patch was a sanctuary, the one place where he didn't feel small. As he started his routine, dribbling between the rocks, sprinting from one end of the field to the other, he didn't notice the man watching from the edge of the field. He was focused, his mind on the game he played in his head, picturing himself in a real match, facing defenders, making plays. He wasn't expecting to be interrupted. So, when the voice called out, it startled him. "Hey, kid!" Lucas stopped, the ball rolling to a slow stop at his feet. He turned to see a man standing just beyond the goalpost, wearing a baseball cap and sunglasses, his arms crossed over his chest. Lucas didn't recognize him, but there was something about the way the man stood there, watching, that made his heart race. "You've got some skills," the man said, walking onto the field. Lucas blinked, unsure if he'd heard right. "Me?" The man chuckled. "Yeah, you're out here every day, right?" Lucas nodded slowly, still trying to figure out who this guy was and why he was suddenly interested in what he was doing. "I guess," Lucas replied, his voice uncertain. "I've been watching you for a few days now," the man continued, stopping in front of Lucas. "You've got potential. Ever thought about trying out for a real club?" Lucas's heart skipped a beat. Was this really happening? He could hardly believe what he was hearing. All the doubt, all the frustration from being overlooked. It all seemed to fade for a moment, replaced by a flicker of hope. "A club?" Lucas asked, his voice quiet but steady. The man nodded. "Yeah, I'm a scout for one of the regional teams. We're always looking for new talent, and I've seen how hard you've been working out here. You've got the technical skills, but I need to see how you handle yourself in a real game." He pulled a card from his pocket and handed it to Lucas. "Come to the tryouts next week. Let's see what you've got." Lucas stared at the card in his hand, barely able to breathe. Was this real? Was he dreaming? For so long, he had been waiting for anyone to notice him, to give him a chance. And now here it was, his big opportunity. The man clapped him on the shoulder. "Don't get too excited just yet, kid. You've got talent, but a lot of players do. The question is, can you perform when it matters?" Lucas nodded, his heart racing. "I'll be there." That night, Lucas couldn't sleep. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the card clutched in his hand. His mind buzzed with excitement, but also with nerves. This was it, the chance he had been waiting for. But with it came the pressure. What if he wasn't good enough? What if the other players were faster, stronger, better? The doubts crept in uninvited, making his stomach twist into knots. By the time the day of the tryouts arrived, Lucas's nerves were nearly unbearable. His mother had packed him a lunch and wished him luck with a tight hug and a reassuring smile. But as much as he tried to focus on her words of encouragement, all Lucas could think about was how badly he wanted this. He needed to show them, needed to prove to himself that he wasn't wasting his time. He wasn't too small. He wasn't too weak. He belonged on that field, and now was his chance to show it. When Lucas arrived at the tryouts, his stomach flipped. The field was packed with boys just like him, all hoping for the same thing, a spot on the team. And many of them were bigger, stronger, more confident than Lucas. He could see it in the way they laughed and joked with one another, while Lucas stood alone, holding his ball tightly in his hands. The scout from the other day was there, clipboard in hand, surveying the field. He gave Lucas a nod as he passed, but didn't stop to talk. Lucas took a deep breath and closed his eyes for a moment. "You've got this," He reminded himself of all the mornings he spent alone on that dirt field, working harder than anyone else. The tryouts began, and Lucas pushed himself harder than he ever had before. He didn't have the height or the strength of some of the other players, but he had something else: speed, agility, and a vision of the game that surprised even him. He weaved between defenders, executed perfect passes, and when it came time to shoot, he struck the ball with a precision that made the scout raise an eyebrow. For hours, Lucas played with everything he had. By the end of the day, his legs were shaking with exhaustion, and his shirt was drenched with sweat. He could barely stand, but he didn't care. He had given everything he had, and for the first time, he felt like he belonged. As the players gathered around the scout, waiting for the results, Lucas stood on the edge of the group, his heart pounding. This was a moment. The scout scanned the list in his hand, then looked up at the boys in front of him. "You," he said, pointing directly at Lucas. "You've got potential. Welcome to the team." Lucas couldn't believe it. He had made it. He was officially part of the team. The thought of wearing the club's jersey, of playing on a real team, filled him with pride. But as the excitement settled, a new reality began to sink in. This was just the beginning. Making the team was one thing, but now he had to prove that he belonged. The first day of training was tougher than Lucas had expected. As soon as he arrived at the club, he could feel the eyes on him. The other boys were taller, bulkier, and carried themselves with a confidence that made Lucas feel smaller than ever. Some of them looked at him with curiosity, others with indifference, but a few seemed openly skeptical. "Is that the new kid?" one of them whispered as Lucas walked onto the field. "He's tiny. How's he going to keep up with us?" Lucas pretended not to hear, but the words stung. He had gotten used to hearing things like that, but it didn't make it any easier. Still, he wasn't here to impress them. He was here to play football, and that's what he intended to do. The first few drills were rough. The pace was faster than anything Lucas had ever experienced. The boys moved with precision and power, their passes sharp, their tackles strong. Lucas struggled to keep up, his smaller frame making it harder to win challenges or hold his ground. Every time he was knocked off the ball, he could feel the eyes on him, judging him, waiting for him to fail. The coach, a gruff man named Coach Silva, was hard to read. He barked orders at the team, pushing them to move faster, play smarter. Lucas noticed the way Coach Silva watched him, his expression tight, his eyebrows furrowed in thought. Lucas wondered if the coach was thinking the same thing everyone else seemed to be thinking. Was Lucas really cut out for this? After the first practice, Lucas was exhausted. His legs ached, his lungs burned, and his confidence was shaken. He hadn't played badly, but he hadn't stood out either. In a world where everyone was bigger and stronger, Lucas felt like he was constantly playing catch-up. In the locker room, as the boys changed and talked about the session, Lucas sat quietly, trying to go unnoticed. But one of the older boys, Diego, wasn't going to let that happen. "So, how'd you end up here anyway?" Diego asked, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You're what, 5 feet tall?" The others laughed, and Lucas felt his face flush. He didn't know how to respond, so he just shrugged and kept his head down. "You must be really fast or something," Diego continued, clearly enjoying the attention. "I mean, you'd have to be, right? Otherwise, there's no way they'd let someone your size on the team." Lucas's heart raced. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he just grabbed his bag and headed for the door, the laughter echoing in his ears as he left the locker room. At home, Lucas sat at the kitchen table, staring at his dinner. His mother, always perceptive, noticed right away that something was wrong. "Lucas, how was training?" she asked, sitting down across from him. Lucas shrugged, picking at his food. "It was fine." Anna raised an eyebrow. "Just fine." Lucas sighed. "It's harder than I thought. The guys, they're all bigger, stronger. I don't know if I can keep up." Anna reached across the table and took his hand. "Lucas, you faced challenges before. You didn't quit then, and you won't quit now. You're on that team for a reason. You belong there." Lucas wanted to believe her, but the doubts were creeping back in. What if Diego was right? What if this was a mistake? The next few weeks were grueling. Lucas showed up to every practice, determined to prove himself, but it was clear that the team still didn't see him as an equal. Every time he got knocked off the ball or missed a pass, he could feel their eyes on him, like they were waiting for him to mess up. Diego especially seemed to enjoy making Lucas feel small, both on and off the field. Coach Silva wasn't helping either. He rarely gave Lucas any feedback, positive or negative. Instead, he just watched, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Lucas couldn't tell if the coach was impressed or disappointed. All he knew was that he had to keep pushing. Then came the day when everything came to a head. It was a scrimmage game during practice, and Lucas was determined to make an impact. He had been working on his speed and agility, knowing that his best chance to stand out was to outmaneuver the bigger players. For most of the game, he managed to hold his own, dodging tackles, making quick passes. But then, in the final minutes, Diego, frustrated by Lucas's persistence, went in hard for a tackle. Lucas saw him coming, but it was too late. Diego's body slammed into him, sending Lucas sprawling to the ground. The pain shot through his leg, and for a moment, Lucas thought he wouldn't be able to get up. The game stopped, and everyone gathered around. Lucas lay there, the wind knocked out of him, his leg throbbing. Diego stood over him, his expression smug. "Maybe you should sit this one out. Short stuff," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Lucas clenched his jaw, fighting back the tears of frustration. He wasn't going to let Diego get the better of him. Not like this. With a deep breath, he pushed himself to his feet, ignoring the pain. He wasn't going to quit. Not now, not ever. Coach Silva walked over, his face serious. "You all right, kid?" Lucas nodded, even though his leg was screaming in pain. "I'm fine." The coach's eyes narrowed. "You sure?" Lucas nodded again, more firmly this time. "Yeah, I'm sure." Coach Silva stared at him for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, back in the game." Lucas limped back onto the field, his body aching, but his resolve stronger than ever. He had made a promise to himself, and he wasn't about to break it. Not for Diego, not for anyone. The pain in Lucas's leg didn't go away after practice. That night, he struggled to walk, limping as he made his way up to his room. His muscles ached from the fall, but the real pain was a fear gnawing at his insides. What if this was it? What if he couldn't recover quickly enough? What if this was just another sign that he wasn't meant to play at this level? He lay on his bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling more defeated than he had in a long time. The whispers in the back of his mind were getting louder, telling him that maybe everyone had been right all along. Maybe Diego was right. Maybe he was just too small for this game. The next morning, his leg still hurt, and Lucas knew he couldn't train. He went to practice anyway, sitting on the sidelines, watching as his teammates ran through their drills. Diego, as usual, dominated the field, his powerful presence drawing the attention of the coach and the other players. Lucas tried not to feel jealous, but it was hard. Every time he looked at his leg, a sharp reminder of the injury, the doubts piled higher. And with each passing day that he sat on the sidelines watching, those doubts grew. Would he ever get back to full strength? And even if he did, would it be enough? Days turned into a week, and Lucas hadn't stepped back on the field. His leg was healing, but the mental battle was harder to overcome. The team was preparing for an important friendly match, a game that would determine the starting lineup for the upcoming season. Lucas knew this was his chance to prove himself, but now it seemed like that chance was slipping through his fingers. Sitting at the dinner table one evening, Lucas barely touched his food. His mother, always attentive, noticed his quiet mood and asked him about it. "Lucas, are you worried about your leg?" she asked, her voice gentle. Lucas looked up from his plate, not sure how to explain what was really bothering him. "It's not just that," he admitted. "I'm scared, Mom. What if I'm not ready for the game? What if I can't keep up?" Anna leaned forward, her eyes full of understanding. "Lucas, you've worked so hard to get where you are. Don't let one setback make you forget everything you've achieved. But what if the setback is too big? Lucas asked, his voice small. What if I'm just not enough? His mother smiled softly. You are enough, Lucas. You've always been enough. You just have to believe it, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. Lucas wanted to believe her, but the fear was overwhelming. That night, as he lay in bed, his thoughts raced. He couldn't shake the feeling that maybe this was the end of the road. Maybe his body just wasn't built for this, and no amount of training or effort could change that. But then, something shifted. Lying there in the quiet, Lucas thought back to all the mornings he had spent on the field, training alone, pushing himself harder than anyone else. He thought about how far he had come, about the small victories along the way that had kept him going. And suddenly, the thought of giving up felt wrong, like a betrayal to all the work he had put in. Lucas knew he couldn't quit. Not now. Not after everything. If this was going to be his last shot, then he was going to give it everything he had. The next day, Lucas limped onto the field for practice. His leg still wasn't fully healed, but he didn't care. He needed to play, to feel the ball at his feet again. Coach Silva noticed him immediately. You sure you're ready for this? The coach asked, his tone skeptical. Lucas nodded, his jaw set. I'm ready. Coach Silva raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. All right, let's see what you've got. The drills were hard, and Lucas felt the strain on his leg with every sprint, every change of direction. But he pushed through the pain, focusing on his technique, using his speed and agility to compensate for his lack of power. By the end of the session, he was exhausted, but something had shifted. The fire was back. When the day of the friendly match arrived, Lucas was nervous, but it was a different kind of nervous. This time, it wasn't about fear, it was about anticipation. He knew this was his chance, and he was determined to make the most of it. As the team gathered in the locker room, the atmosphere was tense. Everyone knew what was at stake. Coach Silva walked in, clipboard in hand, his expression serious. All right, boys, this is it, he said, his voice firm. This game is your chance to prove you belong in the starting lineup. I want to see your best out there. Lucas felt his heart race as the coach began listing off the starting 11. His name wasn't on the list. He would be starting the game on the bench. Disappointment washed over him, but he pushed it aside. This wasn't over yet. The game started, and Lucas watched from the sidelines, his leg bouncing nervously. Diego was on the field, dominating as usual, his confidence radiating with every move he made. Lucas knew he would get his chance. It was only a matter of time. Halfway through the second half, Coach Silva called his name. Lucas, you're in, the coach said, his voice steady. Lucas's heart leapt as he jumped to his feet, ignoring the lingering pain in his leg. This was it. This was his moment. As soon as he stepped onto the field, everything else faded away. The crowd, the pressure, the doubts, all of it disappeared. It was just him and the ball. The game was fast, and Lucas could feel the intensity with every pass, every tackle. But he didn't let it overwhelm him. He stayed focused, using his speed and quick thinking to make plays. Then, with only minutes left in the game, the ball came to Lucas at the edge of the box. He didn't hesitate. With a quick flick of his foot, he weaved past two defenders, his body moving instinctively. And then, with all the power he could muster, he struck the ball. The shot flew past the goalkeeper, hitting the back of the net. The crowd erupted. Lucas stood there, breathing hard, his heart pounding in his chest. He had done it. The roar of the crowd echoed in Lucas's ears, but for a moment, everything else felt still. He stood there, staring at the ball nestled in the back of the net, hardly believing what had just happened. His teammates rushed toward him, shouting and slapping his back, their excitement contagious. For the first time since joining the club, Lucas felt like he truly belonged. He had done it. He had scored the goal that could change everything. But the game wasn't over yet. There were still a few minutes left, and Lucas knew that he couldn't afford to let his guard down. As the opposing team restarted play, Lucas refocused, his mind sharp, His legs still ached, but the adrenaline surging through him made it easy to ignore the pain. Coach Silva shouted from the sidelines, his voice hoarse from yelling directions. "Keep pressing. Stay on them." Lucas followed the coach's orders, chasing down every loose ball, putting pressure on the opposing players. He could feel the shift in the game. The momentum was with his team now, and Lucas was determined to make sure it stayed that way. The minutes ticked down, and with every second that passed, the tension on the field grew. Then, just before the final whistle blew, Lucas found himself with the ball at his feet again. He glanced up, scanning the field, looking for a teammate to pass to. But the defenders were closing in fast, and Lucas realized he didn't have time to think. Instinct took over, and before he knew it, he was weaving through the defenders, using his speed and agility to dodge their tackles. The crowd held its breath as Lucas raced toward the goal. The goalkeeper moved to close him down, but Lucas was already 2 steps ahead. With a quick flick of his foot, he chipped the ball over the goalkeeper's outstretched arms. The ball sailed through the air, and for a split second, time seemed to stop. Then, it landed in the back of the net. The stadium exploded with noise. Lucas could hardly hear himself think over the sound of the crowd cheering, but it didn't matter. All that mattered was the look on his teammates' faces as they ran to him, the pride in their eyes as they lifted him off the ground in celebration. For the first time, Lucas didn't feel small. He didn't feel out of place. He had proven, not just to his team, but to himself, that he belonged here. The doubts, the whispers, the constant struggle to prove himself, it all seemed so distant now. All that mattered was this moment, this victory. As the final whistle blew, Lucas's teammates swarmed him, congratulating him on his performance. Even Diego, who had been Lucas's harshest critic, gave him a nod of respect. It wasn't much, but coming from Diego, it felt like a victory in itself. Coach Silva walked over, his face unreadable as usual. Lucas braced himself for whatever the coach was about to say, his heart still pounding from the game. "You did good out there, kid," the coach said, clapping Lucas on the shoulder. "Real good." Lucas felt a wave of relief wash over him. Those words, simple as they were, meant everything. He had earned the respect of his coach, his teammates, and most importantly, himself. As Lucas headed toward the locker room, still riding the high of the game, he couldn't help but think about how far he had come. From the kid who was too small to be picked for games at school, to scoring the winning goal in a real match. It felt like a dream come true. But more than that, Lucas realized that the real victory wasn't the goal. It was the journey. Every early morning training session, every moment of doubt, every time he wanted to quit but didn't, had led him to this point. And in that moment, Lucas knew that this was just the beginning. The weeks following the game were a whirlwind. Lucas's performance on the field hadn't gone unnoticed. Coach Silva had started giving him more time in the matches, and his confidence grew with every opportunity. His teammates, once skeptical of his abilities, now looked to him as an essential part of the team. The transformation felt surreal, but Lucas knew it had come from the hard work and determination that had carried him through every challenge. Then came the moment Lucas had dreamed of his whole life. It was a sunny afternoon when Lucas got the news. He had just finished another grueling training session and was packing up his gear when Coach Silva approached him with an unreadable expression on his face. "Lucas," the coach said, his voice calm but serious, "I've got something for you." Lucas's heart raced. The coach handed him a crisp white envelope, and for a moment, Lucas wasn't sure what it was. But as he opened it, his eyes widened. It was an official letter, a letter from the national team. "You've been called up to represent the country in the youth squad," Coach Silva said, a rare smile crossing his face. "You've earned it." Lucas could hardly believe what he was hearing. This was it. The dream that had kept him going through all the tough times, all the doubts and struggles, was finally coming true. He was going to wear the jersey of his country. The weeks leading up to the first match with the national team were filled with a mix of excitement and nerves. But every time Lucas felt the familiar flicker of doubt, he reminded himself of everything he had overcome to get here. This wasn't about proving anything to anyone anymore. He had already done that. Now, it was about playing a game he loved, the game that had always been a part of him. On the day of the match, Lucas stood in the tunnel, waiting to step onto the field. His heart pounded in his chest as he adjusted the jersey, the national colors, with his name printed on the back. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times, but now that it was here, it felt even more overwhelming. When the whistle blew and the game began, everything else melted away. The crowd, the pressure, the expectations, it all faded into the background. It was just Lucas and the ball, and in that moment, he felt more alive than he ever had. The game flew by in a blur of passes, tackles, and goals. Lucas played with everything he had, every touch of the ball, reminding him of why he had worked so hard to get here. When the final whistle blew, his team had won, and Lucas had played a key role in the victory. But as he stood there, looking out at the sea of cheering fans, Lucas knew that the real victory wasn't on the scoreboard. The real victory was in the journey that had brought him here. The long hours of training, the moments of doubt, the pain and the joy of never giving up. It was a determination to keep going, even when the world said he couldn't. As the national anthem played, and Lucas stood shoulder to shoulder with his teammates, he couldn't help but smile. This was everything he had ever wanted. And as the flag waved above the stadium, Lucas knew that no matter what came next, he had already achieved his dream. Because in the end, it wasn't about his size or the obstacles he had faced. It was about his heart. And Lucas's heart had always been big enough for the game.